Hello and welcome to a Weekly Stuff bonus podcast with Jonathan Lack
and Sean Chapman.
We are here, as we are every month now, to talk about classic Doctor Who.
Yes, we are.
This month on the show, we are talking about the fifth Doctor, Peter Davison, and the classic story, Kinda.
Or I think how the title came about is they kept on asking, they showed the story to a bunch of people, and they said, do you understand what that just happened? And they all went, kinda?
That's pretty much it.
That's a title.
Yes. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. I do want to note, I am recording this in my Fourth Doctor scarf that I bought. I feel kind of silly with it on indoors with no coat on, so I'm probably going to take it off at some point in this recording.
Because also, we're not talking about Tom Baker today. We're talking about Mr. Davison. So you should have brought in a stick of celery and just put it in your, pocket or something.
Well, I had just bought the scarf, and we did have our first snowstorm of the season here in Colorado, so it served a practical purpose on the way over here. But for now, I'm just wearing it to help get in the mood. But you're right. If the doctor we are talking about today does not wear a scarf,
no, he wears decorative vegetable.
Yes,
and it is a lot of cricket stuff.
It's a good costume.
It's a good costume.
Yeah,
it's got question marks. It's the whole. We are in Jonathan. I'm very pleased and sort of tentative that we are now in 1980s Doctor Who. We're in the last stretch.
It's a journey.
Yes, we're in the last stretch of classic Doctor Who.
We are.
We made it through the black and white years. We made it through the unit years. We made it through the insanity that is the wonderful insanity that is Tom Baker.
Yes.
And now we're in the 80s with John Nathan Turner and the BBC trying to actively destroy the show and question marks on the costumes.
Well,
and the Peter Howell theme. It's all different now.
I have a lot of questions about this, Sean. But first, let's just set the stage. We've been doing this every month. If you're just coming in now, this is our 6th episode, even though it's the 5th Doctor, because we did 2 Tom Baker stories, because he was around forever.
Yeah.
So you can listen to both of those. But we are back with the 5th Doctor. The point of this project, as always, is to help ease those who have maybe not gotten into classic Doctor Who by picking some of the best or most interesting stories, and hopefully both, if they overlap, of the era that we are talking about. Today we are moving on to the 5th Doctor, Peter Davison, as we said. But also, I think, as notable as the Doctor and all that stuff, this is when we have to start talking about all the periphery you're talking about.
Yeah.
Which is, and it's interesting because it sort of mirrors, if not qualitatively in terms of the production changes, what modern Who is going through, which is a huge behind-the-scenes shift, and I think it's useful to look back at this moment as a cautionary tale, probably.
Yeah.
But, still interesting. So, Sean, throughout the 1980s, the show was produced by John Nathan Turner, had a lot of changes that you mentioned. Where do you want to kind of start that discussion of the era Kinda takes place in?
Yeah, so, because obviously we'll spread this conversation across these 3 podcasts, because again, John Nathan Turner was producer for the most number of Doctors by far, because he was the producer for the last season of Tom Baker, all 3 seasons of Peter Davison, the 2 seasons for Colin Baker, and all 3 Sylvester McCoy seasons. He was, when I say that he was the producer for Doctor Who during the 80s, I literally mean he was the producer for Doctor Who from the year 1980 to the day it was canceled in 1989. Yes. Technically, he was fired in 1990 because the show was technically on hiatus before it was technically canceled. So it's for the entirety of the 1980s, he was the producer and effective showrunner on the show because he went through a number of different script editors. We'll talk about those.
Kinda itself went through 3 script editors.
Yeah.
You'll learn on the bonus features. It's fascinating.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting, strange period in the history of the show, and I think it is typically looked on, and I think it's fair enough that I kind of look on it this way, as the weakest period in the history of the show.
But that's a long period.
It's a long period, and it's a period of weird and strange decline that involves a lot of stuff with this competitive, weird relationship with the BBC, and Michael Grade who was a person at the BBC at the time who specifically kind of had it out for the show, and John Nathan Turner's sort of larger than life personality, kind of guiding things behind the scenes, because obviously he was also, as producer, he was instrumental in selecting who each of the different Doctors were going to be. So before we talk about Peter Davison and the 5th Doctor years specifically, we have to talk about the last Tom Baker season, because that's when John Nathan Turner comes on. So Tom Baker was on for 7 years, which is a long fucking time. And 3 of those years, you had Peter Hinchcliffe and Robert Holmes, which we talked about with Brandon Morbius, and then you have Graham Williams comes on after that, and he's the producer for 3 years, and those are still good, and obviously we talked about that on the City of Death, the last episode, but that was started around the shift of the show sort of like having this tentative relationship with the BBC, because the Hinchcliffe years were dark and violent and weird and experimental, and so the BBC kind of pressured Hinchcliffe out of there, brought on Graham Williams, and Graham Williams had this sort of objective of make it lighter, make it funnier. Tom Baker is obviously a very gifted comic actor as well as a dramatic actor, so that kind of helped. And those years, the Graham Williams years, are kind of inconsistent, but have lots of bright spots. Like, the Key to Time season is great. Obviously, City of Death is great. Douglas Adams, in his 2 episodes with like the Pirate Planet, and then Shada, which you can now is 3 episodes if you get the Shada Blu-ray now.
And a very important piece in Doctor Who history, because that was the last one of that production team.
Yes, and
the last one of the 1970s. So it's the last of all these things, and it wasn't really completed until 2017. Which is cool. We talked about that on a recent main Weekly Stuff podcast.
Yeah, so like Douglas Adams was that Douglas Adams year. That was the last year with Graham Williams, and what feels like the old classic Doctor Who, if you want to make that distinction.
Before electronica entered the theme song.
Exactly.
Is that where we want to go with
it?
Yeah.
And so then eventually Graham Williams left the show, and they brought on John Nathan Turner as the producer. And if you've listened to our main podcast and our the Doctor Who discussions on our main podcast over the years, you've probably heard me allude to John Nathan Turner, or JNT, as he's often referred to, because he is this really controversial figure in the history of the show, and there are a lot of reasons that go into that. And one of the main ones is when John Nathan Turner came on, he made this huge, massive sweeping change to basically every single element of the show. So, and one of the most notable ones is down to the theme song. They had been using more or less the Delia Derbyshire version, the original version of the theme, since 1963. Some modifications here and there, but generally speaking, it was that exact same version of the theme. And one of the things that J&T did was he came on and he said, let's spice it up for the 1980s. It's a new decade, new theme.
I will say, he was fucking prescient in where the 1980s were going to go, because that is an 80s-ass theme.
It's very defining, of the tone of the decade.
Either he was prescient or it helped define the culture. Maybe a mix of both.
Probably both. But so he brought on Peter Howell, who would be a composer among a number of composers that would work in the incidental music over the years. And Peter Howell is the incidental composer for Kinda, which is the episode we're going to be talking about in depth. And Peter Howell made this sort of the updated electronica theme that starts with that I always really love. And I really like that version of the theme.
It's very good.
It's very good, and it's just, it's like a whole new logo. They took a new picture of Tom Baker staring bewilderedly into the camera.
It's the one Doctor Who face credits shot that looks like the Doctor didn't know he was being photographed.
Yeah, it's a funny, weird photograph. He changed the costume for the Fourth Doctor, and I really do not like the last season Fourth Doctor costume. It's this weird sort of burgundy red, and it loses the rich sort of variety of colors that
because he even changes the scarf, which
there's
a whole behind the scenes drama of that John Nathan Turner wanted to get rid of the scarf, and Tom Baker and the costume designer fought to have just a different scarf.
Yes, and so that's where and then I think the most infamous change, the most absurd, horrible, just abjectly stupid fucking idea maybe ever in the history of the show is the question marks on the costume. And so for Tom Baker's last season, he is stuffed into this bad burgundy coat with this dumb burgundy scarf that doesn't look cool, and with fucking question marks on the collar of his white shirt. And every subsequent Doctor for the 80s over J&T's tenure would have the question marks, and every single actor hated it. Basically all of those actors, like Peter Davison, Colin Baker, and Sylvester McCoy, all had severe concerns about specific elements of their wardrobe. They did not have complete control over their wardrobe. Some of those costumes I still like.
I'll say, I would not have guessed that about Sylvester McCoy, because he leans into it. He uses that question mark umbrella well.
He is the one I think that most pulls it off in a lot of ways. But it's... And so John Nathan Turner's sort of figure on the show is it definitely felt like he Like, it's extremely noticeable when he takes over. In a way that, if you're just a casual viewer of the show and you're not interested in what's going on behind the scenes, you'd be forgiven most of the time of being like, oh, like, yeah, like, things changed when you went from the Third Doctor to the Fourth Doctor, but there's still, like, the core, like the opening credits is still the same. Like, a lot of the names in the credits is still the same. Like, you're still going to see Barry Letts pop up every now and then as, like, a figure in the show, as an executive producer or director, writer of an episode.
But just in general, it feels like the Doctor Who you'd been watching as a broad spectrum, you know?
Yeah. This is a hard shift. And a part of that was also not just what you saw, but going on behind the scenes is that he also, he got rid of Dudley Simpson, which is one of the greatest crimes in the history of classic Doctor Who.
The composer who
yes,
had done...
the composer who we've talked about on most of these episodes, because he did incidental music for the vast majority of the history of classic Doctor Who. He got rid of Dudley Simpson, brought on folks like Peter Howell and several others that still did good work, but, like, fuck, Dudley Simpson's Dudley Simpson.
Well,
man.
and what he did is he went completely in-house with the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, which Dudley Simpson was not a part of, so it was half a cost-saving measure, half a creative decision.
Yeah. So he also stopped working with a lot of the, like, recurring writers. I think there's only 2 writers, Robert Holmes and Terrence Dicks, that kept on working and wrote a couple of episodes. Like, Robert Holmes, in particular, like, he did not write any stories for all 3 of the Fifth Doctor years until the last one. Like, he wrote the last Fifth Doctor story, Caves of Androzani, but nothing in between there.
And I know
he had written, like, 1 or 2 stories per season since the Second Doctor, like, the last Second Doctor
Well,
season.
and the Terrence Dicks story in Baker's last season, which is part of the State of Decay, I think it is, was written years earlier, and they just, like, they were like, we need an extra story. They dusted it off and changed the names, like, you know.
Yeah. So they, like, you know, basically all new writers, and there aren't a lot of very notable writers in this era, where, like, the episode we're talking about has like one of the only. And then also directors, like, most of the directors that had been working on Doctor Who over the years did not come back, and he also didn't manage to, and when we were talking about Kinda proper, I have a whole interview that I want to read from that's very interesting about this, but, like, he didn't keep directors very well, and he didn't bring back old directors. So it was like, there's something about JNT's era that he had this extreme resistance to bringing back anything old from the show. His direction also, like overall on the show, pushed it back into the, like, kind of more weird and violent territory that you, like, kind of would associate with the Hinchcliffe years, but I don't think with anywhere near the skill and elegance. And so that's part of what got it in trouble with the BBC. We'll talk about that a lot more when we get to the Sixth Doctor, because that's where it becomes much more of an issue. But it's true of the Fifth Doctor years as well, and I think, like, some of his style of Doctor Who is just kind of unpleasant. Instead of being dark, it's just like, this is just kind of gross. Like, this isn't interesting. This isn't, like, mature or interesting in that way. It's just kind of, like, violent for violence sakes to sort of, like, you know, shock the viewer in some ways. And so he's this weird, controversial figure. The last big change, I guess, thinking about it, is companions. And this is, particularly for the Fifth Doctor, a weird issue, is that John Nathan Turner really wanted to bring back a bigger crew. Like the way that you had in the first Doctor seasons, like, go back to our Aztecs episode, and where we talk about the full crew that we have there of Ian, Barbara, and Susan, as well as the Doctor. But John Nathan Turner also had this tendency of making companions, like, in this very sort of utilitarian way. For example, we have the companion Tegan, who is an Australian stewardess, or flight attendant stewardess at the time, who existed and was Australian specifically to try to cater to and get Australian viewers. And, like, that's why she's Australian. And then also, this is the
Sean,
period...
can I tell you something?
Yeah.
I watched all of Kinda. I would not have known she's Australian.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's the one of the blessings of Kinda is that the companions don't really show up too much. And then one of when we talk about the Sixth Doctor, his main companion, Perry, is quote-unquote American. You wouldn't be able to tell from the accent. She's supposed to be American. And that was because this was also the period where PBS in America was showing reruns of Tom Baker stories. And so Doctor Who got this small cult following over here. So JNT also had this obsession with, like, going to America, going to the conventions, like, showing off Doctor Who in America, like the nerd convention thing in America was just kicking off, and, like, Star Trek conventions, that kind of stuff. So they started doing Doctor Who conventions. and JNT would go there personally and show up there. And so he made Perry an American companion, Perry also being the Caves of Androzani companion, so right at the end of the Fifth Doctor years. She's American to try to cater to an American audience, which, like, such an unbelievably misguided decision, which we will talk about with Visions of Varos more specifically when we get to Perry. But yeah, his whole aim with the companion thing, laden down the Fifth Doctor with all this baggage, and the Fourth Doctor's last season also, because if you go on the I'm on the TARDIS wiki right now, which is like the Doctor Who fan wiki that has a lot of good like sort of cast and crew information, and they have for the seasons a section that is recurring cast, and for the vast majority of Doctor Who, it's 2 names and sometimes 3. So it's like, for the vast majority of Doctor Who, it's like Tom Baker and Elizabeth Sladen as Sarah Jane Smith. It's like the Doctor, the Companion, the Doctor, the Companion, like the Doctor, the Companion, K9, blah, blah, blah. And then you get to season 18, and there are 7 names, one of which is the Master that they brought back. That's like, maybe he's not a true recurring cast, he's in 2 stories, but whatever. But it's like the last Tom Baker season has Tom Baker as the Doctor, Lala Ward is Romana 2, who leaves halfway through the season, John Leeson is K9, who leaves halfway through the season, Matthew Waterhouse as Adric, who we'll talk about, who's introduced halfway through the season, Sarah Sutton as Nyssa, who we are kind of not going to talk about because she's not really in Kinda. I'll address her. But she's introduced near the end of the season, and then Tegan, who's introduced in the Fourth Doctor's last story. So over the course of his last season, he says goodbye to 2 companions and is introduced to 3 companions, one of whom is in his last story, and then the Fifth Doctor is just thrown into this situation where he has 3 different companions, none of them synergize well, like they're just like this group of sort of random people, and none of the writers knew what to do with it. So I think maybe that's where unless you have other comments or questions, we can start to transition to talking about Kinda.
My only comment is that I'm actually very excited to get to the last Tom Baker season, only because I'm so fascinated by what the fuck that thing is.
It's really weird. Yeah, it features a trilogy of stories called the E-Space Trilogy in the middle, because Adric does not come from our universe, he comes from E-Space. I don't really remember what E-Space actually is. It's a different universe, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I'm so curious. But yes. So where do you want to go next? You want to talk about Kinda and the Fifth Doctor and all that?
Yeah, let's talk about Kinda. So Kinda comes from the first Fifth Doctor season, from that's like 1982, because actually they took a year off basically between the 1980 season and the Fifth Doctor's first season.
I think Tom Baker's last season extended just into 1981.
Yeah, and then most of 1981 there was no Doctor Who on the air.
Yeah, Tom Baker's weird because he has... Well, he's weird for many reasons. His run is weird because it technically starts in 1974 because Robot Part 1 aired December 29th.
Right.
And into 1981 because he had like 1 episode there. It's kind of like David Tennant is 2005, 2010, even though that's a Christmas and a New Year's Day episode bookending that.
Exactly.
So it's very facetious to actually call those his years, but that's how the usual count is, like on the DVDs. Anyway, but yeah, so we're in 1982 now.
Yeah, so we're in 1982, and we're... So we've got the Fifth Doctor, we've got these 3 companions, Adric, Tegan, and Nyssa, and then we also have a bevy of script editors to sort of briefly address. We have Christopher Bidmead, who was the script editor for the last Tom Baker season. That's the only season he was on. He did some work script editing the Kinda script, but then he was off the show before this season. And then you had Anthony Root, who was like a weird temporary script editor who they put in to be script editor, and he was like, I think I can do this, and was the script editor for like a month. And he said, I don't want to do this anymore. And so he left, and so then we bring on Eric Sayward, who is the, like, I think he's like the one sort of like figure for me you can latch onto in the JNT, like this sort of like half of the JNT years. Like the Seventh Doctor's last 2 seasons are different, and we'll talk about that there in that episode. But Eric Sayward is the script editor for like basically the vast majority of the Peter Davison's run. If you ignore like the brief amount of work that Anthony Root did and Christopher Bidmead did for the Fifth Doctor, and then for basically all of the Sixth Doctor. So Eric Sayward is basically our script editor. He also wrote most of the best episodes from this era. Like he wrote Earth Shock, which is the story where Adric very suitably is brutally killed as he crashes into the surface of prehistoric Earth on a spaceship. He writes a lot of the good episodes from this era of the show. But like again, some like the behind the scenes stuff, he had a very combative relationship with Jonathan Turner, as you will hear when I read this interview. And then our writer is Christopher Bailey, He only wrote 2 stories, Kinda, and then Kinda has a sequel story called Snake Dance, which is not quite as good, but is also one of the better Fifth Doctor stories. And Christopher Bailey is an interesting writer because he had this interest in sort of Eastern mysticism and Buddhism as a philosophy in particular, and some of that stuff is stuff that manifests in Kinda in this weird sort of like...
He had an interest in it. I'm not sure he had a grasp on it, but
sure, yeah. Like, I'm not going to call it like it's like an exploration of deep Buddhist philosophical themes, but it's like it's one of the elements that gives Kinda this very different feel, and it's one of the things of the reason why I picked it was because one, I think it's really good and I really like it, but it's also a lot of the Fifth Doctor era is weird, and like a lot of the John Nathan Turner years are weird. A lot of them not in good ways.
Well, I was going to say, it's easy to point to why, like, Colin Baker's era is weird.
Yeah.
Like, Rainbow Suit, Perry, they did one season where they did 45-minute episodes.
Yeah.
The episodes aren't that good. Like those are easy ones. Tell me if I'm wrong. It's harder to pinpoint what makes Peter Davison's run off.
Yeah, it's just like there's a lack of consistency between stories. Like, there's a severe lack of consistency, both in tone and in quality, in a way that had not been true for the show ever up to this point. Because you could go from something that's like fairly comedic to something that, like, again, like where one of the companions just straight up fucking dies at the end, which is something that had never really happened. Ignoring one like sort of like footnote from the first Doctor years, that had never happened. It hasn't happened since. It's a dark fucking thing for Doctor Who to do. It's a dark place to go. Like, I mean, Tegan is a companion who is on adventures like completely against her wishes. Like, she's kind of like Ian and Barbara. She's basically kidnapped. But unlike Ian and Barbara, she doesn't have a capacity to really roll with it. So when she leaves Doctor Who, she leaves like the show in tears because she can't take like the brutal violence that she's been witness to all along. And it's like this weird thing of like kind of like bouncing between these extremes, these tonal extremes, and I don't think the show had a good handle on how to deal with that. And some of those dark moments work, a lot of them don't. And so it's just this like very strange concoction of different elements that then also features stories that were just like in their DNA, strange and unusual stories for Doctor Who. Kinda being one of them. Another one of the other stories that was the main one I was considering doing was Enlightenment, which is from later in Peter Davison's run. That is also just sort of weird, and it's shot in weird ways. And it's like the concept of like these like eternal like abstract beings doing like a yacht race in space, which is basically what it is. It's such a weird fucking idea, and it's really well done. But, you know, Doctor Who got weird. I don't know all the reasons why. It just fucking did. But Kinda, I think, is, of those, the best executed of the weirdness. And I think it has, like, a heart and an idea to it that really works for me. And it's also one of the few ones that is, like, well-directed in that way as well.
So is this where you asked me what I thought of Kinda?
Yes, I want to hear what you thought of Kinda, because I got a brief preview on Twitter, but I'm curious to hear more elaborated thoughts.
I don't know. I honestly don't know what I thought of Kinda. I watched it. I thought about it. I thought about it some more. I watched some clips. I watched most of the bonus features on the DVD, other than like the commentary. I didn't watch the whole thing with the commentary again. But that was helpful because some of the behind the scenes on this one is fascinating, and we will talk about that. I honestly don't know what I thought about Kinda because I think it has a lot of... It's exceptionally directed. Who is the director on this? Peter Grimwade?
Peter Grimwade.
And there's a whole feature on the DVD about him, and it sounds like he was a really interesting guy and director, and one of the people affiliated with Doctor Who died kind of young, so he's not around to talk anymore, but they had some footage of him, and like he was famous. He was one of the only directors who like directed on the floor rather than in the studio booth, like all these different things. I think it's an exceptionally directed Doctor Who story. I think it has a good sense of atmosphere. You know, it has striking visuals from moment one to the end with the inflatable snake. You know, it's striking in a lot of ways. I can't tell you what the story was. I can't even begin to tell you what the story was. I can't tell you like how the story progressed or what the ultimate goal was other than stopping the snake we met in the last 5 minutes, because it's kind of all... There's no... And I'm not necessarily saying this is a bad thing. There is no single thrust to the plot of like... There's a bad guy and we have to stop him, or right. People are dying and we have to save them. Like it doesn't work like a normal Doctor Who story in that way. There are a dozen characters and it's all over the map. The Doctor is not a particularly important character in the story, which is interesting. Like, it's a fascinating Doctor Who story. I would have to see it again, probably, to solidify a lot of thoughts on it. And I would also want to see it in its proper context. I don't know if that helps at all. Right. But just like knowing the Fifth Doctor a little more, knowing Tegan and Nyssa, and Nyssa doesn't matter for this one, but some of the
you've got to really understand the depth of Adric as a character.
We'll talk about Adric.
I do want to point out also that this is the third Fifth Doctor story.
Yeah, that's
so
weird.
It's like there's not, like you say you want more context. Yeah. There's not that much more context.
Okay, and so I just don't know what to think about it. Like, I guess in general, does what I'm saying make sense?
Yeah, no. Like again, it's weird. It's unusual for me. It's like the way I would kind of contextualize it is it's sort of the closest Doctor Who ever gets to David Lynch. Like it's. Like, because it's interested in, like, dreams and in, like, sort of, like, this sort of, like, non-logic logic in a way of that, the Kinda are these telepathic people that have this sort of, like, deep, fundamental spiritual understanding of their place in the world on this planet, and, like, contrasted with the very imperialist sort of, like, space colonizers that are, like, very, like, British imperial, almost sort of, like, pantomime people or something. And that sort of contrast, I think, is the heart of where the story lies between the Kinda, which exist on this sort of like level that we can't quite approach, but can sort of appreciate, and then these colonizers that, in an almost like Heart of Darkness way, sort of lose their minds because the rigid world that they come from, does not sort of mesh with this sort of more abstract world that they're sort of coming in contact with.
And I will say, I guess, one of the things I did think watching it, and when I sort of let it sit and thought about it, is I'm not sure I like this story. I think it's a lot of ideas that are being thrown at the wall, and I never got a sense of how they cohere or if they cohere. Like, there's a whole thread with this captain on the ship, like on the colonizing crew, who slowly goes crazy, and it's one of the more interesting parts of the episode, and I can kind of see when you talk about it like that, the Heart of Darkness kind of thematic link. But he also has, like, no real bearing near the end on the action of other things going on. So, like, that's an issue. And one of the things I also want to talk about before we get into the meat of the story itself is, because I want to hear your thoughts on this.
Okay.
One of my issues with Kinda throughout it is that 4 episodes, 90 minutes, I usually have no trouble at this point sitting through a classic Doctor Who story, like, especially if it's only 4 episodes, I'll eat that up like candy. I can do that in one sitting. Kinda got a little tough to sit through, and I realized at a certain point what it was. I didn't care about a single character on screen in this story. I didn't find a single character interesting, and sadly, and this is something I want to talk about, I do extend that to Peter Davison's Doctor.
Yeah.
And that is not me, like, saying I don't think he's a good Doctor, but in the limited amount of stuff I've seen of the Fifth Doctor, he's the only Doctor who's never made a huge impression on me.
Yeah.
Like, we're going to get to Colin Baker next month. I know his stories are up and down. I fucking love Colin Baker's Doctor. I think he's great. Peter Davison, even, like, one of the ones I've seen is Games of Androzani, and he's really good in that. And, like, he's part of some of the most memorable moments in Doctor Who history. I still don't know if I have a huge sense of him as a character from that. He just comes across to me as a little bland and passive. And especially in this story, like, the Doctor is frequently much more, I don't want to say passive, but reactive in classic Doctor Who than he is in modern Doctor Who, because the Doctor doesn't come on a planet, pull out the psychic paper, and just take over everything.
Yeah.
But even on that level, like, the Doctor usually, in any incarnation, has some kind of magnetism, and I don't get that from Peter Davison, and that's one of the things that, when I talk about proper context, again, third story, maybe it won't help, but just, like, I'd like to know that character a little better, because as it is, I felt no cohesive center to this story, and that cohesive center, usually even in the worst Doctor Who stories, is the Doctor.
Yeah.
So I don't know. What are your thoughts on him as the Doctor and the reaction I have to him?
I mean, I basically agree with most of what you've said, of that he is, to me, the least interesting. And I think it's something that he gets so much better when you get to, like, the Big Finish stuff, and he's come back to the role older, because one of the things to talk about with Peter Davison is that he was at the time the youngest Doctor, and that was
Yeah.
true up until Matt Smith came in when he was 2 years old and was like, I can do the Doctor. But Peter Davison was, I think he was like 29, 28 when he first played the role, and part of the reason that he was cast is honestly he was a major character in a really popular show at the time, All Creatures Great and Small, which is based on a series of books, and John Nathan Turner was working on that show as well, and that was the job he left to take over Doctor Who, and so he basically knew Peter Davison from that show, and Peter Davison was popular and well known because of his role in that show, and that's basically the reason why he was cast. Also, like, Peter Davison was a fan of the show, like, you know, he watched it when Patrick Troughton was the Doctor and that kind of stuff, but it is, I think, his version of the Doctor, I think, still can work really well. And I think, like, especially in a story like his of Androzani, and I think in Kinda, I like him in the story, but he is passive. Like, I kind of think of him as the milquetoast Doctor. Like, he doesn't take an active role in the story. He doesn't have that sort of charismatic presence that a story can hinge itself on. I think that's one of the reasons why this era of the show is really inconsistent, is because he can't, like, you know, like William Hartnell and Patrick Troughton and John Pertwee and Tom Baker could all make, like, kind of weaker stories still, like, hang together because they had that presence to them. And that's just not the kind of actor that Peter Davison is. Like, he's like every Doctor has been, and I think basically should be played by a very skilled character actor. But, like, it's typically a very skilled character actor that, like, suddenly can become a leading man, and you, like, never saw that before in them. And I don't think Peter Davison has that leading man quality to him. Like, I don't think he can bring that out, which is something that can work if a story puts him in that position, which is why I think, for me, Kinda works precisely because he's not in an active role. Precisely because, like, in some ways, there's not even really that much of a plot. There are like sort of plot strands that are going on, but there's no, like, traditional larger overarching threat, like, as you identified. Like, you've got the Mara sort of that builds up slowly over the course of it. You've got, like, the private who goes insane on the ship, but it's this sort of more like strands of story threads that are sort of going together that are suggesting larger themes, and he's kind of in the background observing a lot of that. And for me, that works. But, like, I agree that he does not have, like, that presence yet that sort of can pull things through. And it's not until, I think, if you listen to his audio dramas, that he sort of gets that deeper grasp on the Doctor's character.
Yeah, so it's just an interesting thing, especially because I am, as the Scarf can attest to, currently enmeshed in the Fourth Doctor era.
Yeah.
And there's really not a more magnetic Doctor than Tom Baker, who, Tom Baker luckily mostly had very good scripts to work with, but I definitely get the feeling if you threw a real stinker at him, he could make it work, because he would, like, through power of personality.
Yeah.
And, you know, on one hand, I do think Peter Davison is pretty clever casting against the Fourth Doctor, because there's no fucking way to follow up Tom Baker with another Doctor like that, you know? So, like, it does make sense that the Doctor would sort of mellow out after that weird period with the Scarf, you know?
Yeah.
It does feel like it maybe limits some of the places you can take the character, you know?
Yeah.
And even in Kinda, like, it is an interesting study, I actually think, because this was, you know, originally written when Tom Baker was still the Doctor. So, like, in the writing, like, dialogue and stuff, the Doctor is not written all that much differently from what he was in the Fourth Doctor era. And it is a great study in how two actors can play the same character differently. Like, there's a scene, I think it's in the first episode, where there's just a really funny gag the Doctor gets, or where someone is asking him, I forget what the exact line is now. It was one of my favorite moments, and now I'm forgetting it. But it's a very funny little line where he has, like, the Doctor just kind of ping-pongs this response back, and I can totally imagine Tom Baker saying that. But I also, the way Peter Davison does it as a complete deadpan is also very funny. So there's little things like that I find interesting. But yeah, this is a hard episode for me to talk about for a number of reasons that I've outlined, and it is just like, it is completely, you know, singular for Doctor Who. And, you know, when sequences worked for me, they worked very well. I just found it kind of hit and miss, I guess.
Yeah.
Or stop and start. While also understanding, like, I can understand why this one inspires passion, because clearly, it got a sequel, it got a big finish threequel at some point.
Yes, yeah.
It's a fan favorite. You hear about it, mentioned a lot, and I understand all that. It is also interesting to me to study some of the behind the scenes. Like, there's a 40-minute making of doc on this on the DVD, and it's fascinating because you hear from most everyone involved in the production, other than Peter Davison, I feel like, is one kind of notable omission, and John Nathan Turner, who I don't think ever participated in DVD
I mean,
stuff.
he died relatively young.
He did?
died in
Okay.
his 40s.
I forgot when
so
he
I think
died,
he died in like 2004 or something like that.
Okay, so yeah, they never got him on the record for those.
He died in 2002.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But other than that, like, the writers there, the director had died already, but they had archival footage of him talking about the story. And what is so fascinating is it's super candid. Like, that's one of the things about the bonus features on Doctor Who, is they're always very candid. And not a person on that set or in that production agreed what Kinda was about. And I think that's actually one of the fascinating, push and pulls going on in the episode. But, Christopher Bailey had one thing he thought the episode was about. Anthony Root had one thing. Eric Sayward had one thing. They both, helped script edit it. They're both in the documentary. Eric Sayward didn't like the script. He's pretty fucking, upfront about that, which is interesting. The director, Peter Grimwade, had a different thought on what it was. Some of the actors a lot of them didn't understand it at all and were just kind of going for it. Christopher Bailey sounds like he does not really like the finished product because he feels there's a bunch of elements that are not what he had envisioned at all. They all complain about the snake at the end, which is kind of funny. Because I think it's one of the more memorable things in the serial, but I do understand it.
Yeah, that was an effect they had to sort of scramble together at the last minute.
Yeah, and Christopher Bailey is so there's a bunch of tension in the set on this one. There's a lot of kind of unresolved issues, and it is fascinating to watch a story where no one agrees what that story is about. And that's not an infrequent thing in sci-fi,
Yeah.
I think you would probably say that about a number of, Andrei Tarkovsky films. You would definitely say that about the movie Blade Runner, which we both love.
Yeah.
Ridley Scott and Hampton Fancher have completely different views on what that movie's about, and it works. And I think, Kinda does overall work. It's just an interesting work because of all of that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's one of the elements of where I say that this is the closest Doctor Who ever gets to David Lynch isn't exactly that place also, because I think you could say that about basically every single David Lynch movie, is that everybody on that movie has a different understanding of what they're doing.
Except it has David Lynch who knows exactly what he's doing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So.
It's a weird, bizarre episode of the show, and maybe in some ways that's why I felt compelled to pick it as, because that's the other part of this project is it's not just the best ones, it's
right.
Ones that I think that are good that are also usefully representative of elements of that era. And this was the Fifth Doctor year is by far the hardest I had, because I think most of the good episodes from his era are are ones like Earthshock that I don't want to pick because that's the one where fucking Adric is killed, and it's kind of that's not a good one to pick for a number of reasons. You don't know who Adric is yet. That's not necessarily. It's not every single episode has a fucking companion killed in it. But I think lots of the episodes have weird production issues, more so than before. The thing that happened with the snake of them basically having to cobble together this puppet in a week because the effect that they were trying to do wasn't going to pan out was something that happened multiple times over the Fifth Doctor years. In particular, there's one story, Warriors of the Deep, that very infamously, almost all the effects in that are basically the worst the effects had ever been in Doctor Who since 1963, which is fucking a thing.
Yeah.
So it's a weird, inconsistent era, and part of that also, I think, for this story that's very notable is we have to talk about his companions.
Yes, I wanted to
get
to
companions. And it's my one regret in picking this one, but I still don't think there was a better one to pick, is that we don't get Nyssa, because Nyssa is easily the best Fifth Doctor companion. Unquestionably. Unfortunately, she doesn't get enough sort of room to be able to sort of show that off, even in the shows that she's actually in for the full time set at the beginning of the first episode and the end of the last episode, like this one. But yeah, I think one of the reasons why the Peter Davison Doctor gets sort of shoved into the background is because they have so many fucking characters to juggle, and they do not bounce off of each other well, the way that Ian and Barbara could be paired off in one subplot into the First Doctor era and it would work fine. Or Barbara and Susan could go explore something and Ian and the Doctor are paired and it works. Here, and it's not just Kinda, basically every Fifth Doctor story has no idea what to do with these four fucking characters, because you have the Doctor played by Peter Davison, and you have Adric, who's the first of these three companions to be introduced, played by Matthew Waterhouse, who is He's like the sort of the elevator pitch of the character is that he is a boy genius from an alternate dimension called E-Space who has a star for mathematical excellence, who's laden with perhaps the worst costume in the history of Doctor Who for a main character. He's basically wearing a multicolored burlap sack with a cardboard star on his chest, and he's just he's a math genius who's an annoying prick most of the time. And that's basically who Adric is.
Let's talk about Adric for a second.
Yes, we have to talk about Adric.
The pitch boy genius has worked exactly once in modern popular fiction, and that's Robin, and not all the time.
Yeah.
Once in a while, and even then it's Boy Wonder. But you get what I mean. Like,
yes.
Burt Ward's Robin, it works. Other than that, like Wesley from Star Trek, which Adric gives me like PTSD flashbacks of.
He is absolutely Wesley,
yes,
but in Doctor Who.
And I desperately want Patrick Stewart to guest star at some point and be like, "Shut up, Adric," but that's not going to happen because that show isn't made anymore.
Yeah,
you get what I mean. But like, I got what they were going for with Adric about 2 minutes into the episode, and I'm like, oh god, this is what Adric is? Because I actually didn't really know who Adric was, other than he's the kid who dies in Earthshock.
Yeah.
And I think there's a reason for that.
I think so as well. He is not the most annoying companion in the history of the show. He's still not Mel. We're skipping Mel. We're not doing Mel. It's like, I like Bonnie Langford just fine as a person. I think she seems very nice, but man, she was not a good actress at that time, and man, that character was insufferable. But yeah, like, Adric is just fucking dull. Like, he's an extremely dull character. And I'm on your Twitter, Jonathan, trying to find the quote that you posted when you were watching.
Oh, yeah, this was good.
Okay, here we go. You pulled this from the Wikipedia
page for Adric.
Page for Adric because again, this is to remember. This character first appeared with Tom Baker, and I'm very excited for you to get the last season to see that dynamic because it's very strange. But from the Wikipedia page, unimpressed by Waterhouse's acting ability, Tom Baker suggested that because of his amazing appearance, Matthew should have played Adric like Sabu, a little boy who couldn't speak. I would talk to him rather like Basil Fawlty talks to Manuel, and he'd just nod or shake his head. But John Nathan Turner didn't like that idea.
That's a wonderful idea. They should have taken that idea. It wouldn't really work for the Peter Davison Doctor, but for Tom Baker, for him to have like a silent Mowgli-esque companion off to the side, that would be the funniest fucking thing in the world. Yeah. And yes, it's probably the one way you could use Matthew Waterhouse well at this point in his life. Seems like a lovely person. He's on the bonus features too. Yeah. Seems like a really like funny, sweet guy. And he looks back with a lot of self-deprecation. But yeah.
Yeah, no, it's just Adric's annoying. But I think one of the reasons why I don't actually mind him that much in Kinda, because it kind of feels like they know he's annoying and they put him in an annoying position in the story so that it works instead of trying to make him seem likable or heroic in some ways, which some of the stories try to do, and that never works.
It's part of the larger issue, though, here with the four companions, is that this story is so diffuse because of it. Because you have the Doctor over here, Nyssa back in the TARDIS, because she gets knocked out at the beginning, and she's in the TARDIS. And then Tegan is off on her own walkabout through her mind over here for most of it. And Adric is over here annoying soldiers. And, like, the four characters are almost never on screen together. And even, like, subgroups of them are almost never on screen together. And it's a weird quality to this one that I agree, like, here it probably works better than in other places because those story threads have their own weird things going on, and they don't have to cohere as literally. But right, it's like, from this one story, I can't start to imagine what, like, the Tegan-Adric dynamic is like, you know?
Well, you get I think, like the evidence of why I like this story is that you get the one scene in part 4 where Tegan and Adric are reunited and they have a conversation with each other that the Doctor's not present for, and it's like, why? What? It's like no useful information is conveyed. Nothing about their characters spark. They have no chemistry. It's just like the most useless scene. It's like the only reason it exists is because they have these characters and they have to do something with these characters. But there's like, and that's why I think a lot of this era and like this sort of concept of having this big group didn't work this time was because you can't have any of these companions together alone and have that scene be interesting. Like, they just, like, those characters don't spark off of each other. Each of those characters can spark off of the Doctor in ways that are interesting, but none of them can spark off of each other. And that's why, like, the group dynamic doesn't work.
And the Doctor basically has his own companion for most of this, which is Scientist Lady.
Yes.
Whatever her name is.
Basically Liz Shaw. Like, it might as well just be Liz Shaw.
Yeah, and like, seriously, she's the de facto companion in this episode, because she's the one standing next to the Doctor, asking questions, answering questions, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And it's something that she almost... Like, her character could basically be Nyssa, not in the sense of, like, that the character is already there in that environment and knows those things, but the quality of the character of Nyssa. I'll just sort of, like, talk about her a little bit because, she's not really featured in the episode, but she's technically the companion at the time. And again, she's my favorite Fifth Doctor companion, and she's the one that, like, if you listen to the Big Finish audios, she's, like, the one that they bring back because she's really good. Nyssa is from a planet called Traken, from the Keeper of Traken, which is a story where they bring the Master back in the guise of Anthony Ainley, who is technically the Master possesses the body of her father, and regenerates or something. It's very weird. The Time Lord lore gets very weird. They've been some rules in this bit of the show. But she's basically this sort of like princess from a planet that is basically dead now and has been destroyed. And she's sort of kind of like Adric. She's very smart. She can kind of like compete with the Doctor on intellectual terms in a lot of ways. She's one of the reasons why I like her is I tend to like most companions that have a quality to them that separates them from like a normal Earth person. And so she sort of understands alien technology and can engage in that side of the show in a way that's convincing, in a way that Adric does not. Like, Adric is supposed to be able to engage with that part of the show and be that sort of like Zoe from the Second Doctor era, a little bit of Liz Shaw because she was a science genius, like that kind of element, and Romana really had it of being more on an even footing with the Doctor, but Adric could never play convincingly. I think Sarah Sutton does in the guise of Nyssa. Unfortunately, we just don't really get her much in this episode. But if you watch more Fifth Doctor stuff, appreciate Nyssa, because she's by far for me the most interesting of the three. And then we have Tegan, who is one of, I think, the most, like, outside of Mel, and I think even, like different than Adric, she's the most misguided companion in the history of Doctor Who to me. And one of the reasons why I like Kinda, again, is that it uses her in a way that is so different than most stories, and that she gets to have her own weird subplot where, she's, like, in a dream space for most of the story, and then she's possessed for, half of one episode.
It really only lasts the first 2 episodes, and then she's, like, off in the background because it's her possession ends, but yeah.
Yeah, and then she's sort of possessed for a while, and then she gets to come back in the last episode and have a boring scene with Adric, and that's kind of her role in the story. But Tegan is basically the companion that doesn't want to be a companion, which is not a character that I think you can do in Doctor Who. Like, I just don't think it can, like, it can work for a story. Like, you kind of have seen that in some places with, like, temporary companions that don't really pan out over the course of one story or something like that. But Tegan is around, like, longer than Adric. Obviously longer than Adric, because Adric gets fucking killed, but longer than Nyssa, like, by a couple of stories, I think. And she's, her story is in Logopolis, which is the last Tom Baker story. She's an Australian flight attendant who is, I think she's trying to get to the airport or something, like gets inside of the TARDIS thinking that it's an actual police box. I don't know why, because she's from, like, 1980 in Australia. I'm pretty sure they didn't have police boxes in 1980 Australia. I've never been. I just assume. But she gets inside the police box thinking she can get some help, and then I have not watched the beginning of Logopolis since the first time I watched through these stories, so I don't remember all the details. But basically, she is taken without her realizing what is going on, and then this is still the period of the show where the Doctor can't quite properly fly the TARDIS yet, and so the Fifth Doctor is kind of constantly trying to get her back to Heathrow Airport, but never can quite manage to do it. And so it's that sort of back kind of like Ian and Barbara, where she's a companion against her will, but Ian and Barbara, by like the third serial, can roll with it, and they just like operate and function normally in stories, and every once in a while it'll come up of like, come on, Doctor, can you not get us back, and that kind of stuff. Tegan is just constantly a wet fucking blanket all the fucking time, no matter the time. The Doctor tries to do fucking anything, and she fucking complains about it, and it's unbearable most of the time. I really do not like this companion. And so in Kinda, they put her in this role where she's kind of on her own for most of the story.
She's also not, like, Tegan for most of the story, because she's either in this weird LSD headspace, or she's possessed by an evil snake. So, like, she's not really, like, you cannot walk out of this and say, what are the character traits of Tegan? I don't know, she's not really in it.
And once you get to the Fifth Doctor era, I think you'll find that was a big plus for Kinda. But
companions, much like sex partners, should express enthusiastic consent.
Exactly.
This is a truism for Doctor Who. Other than Ian and Barbara, who got away with it because, they got into it.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. And it was the 60s. It was a different time back then. But yeah, no, it's the companion situation for the Fifth Doctor, I think, just never really works. Even when they cycle these companions out, and you have like Turlough comes in, who's okay, but he's saddled with all this bullshit. Like you have Chameleon, the robot companion, that never worked out because the prop didn't work. He was around for 2 stories. And then of course the Fifth Doctor gets Perry at the very end when he regenerates, and then after that they go back to one companion model until the end of the show, because this one just didn't fucking work. And it's one of the things, if you watch interviews with Peter Davison about his time on the show, like the main things he tends to talk about of like things he was displeased with, because I think one of the reasons why he left the show after 3 seasons was, one, he sort of took the Patrick Troughton advice of like leave after 3 years so you don't get typecast, and 2, he just didn't enjoy his time on the show and thought that for most of his time on the show the production was mishandled. And part of that was he did not want to have these companions. He wanted to just have Nyssa, but he couldn't. That was just not an option because he didn't have the clout, you know. And that's one of the reasons why Tom Baker also left. That like Tom Baker had all that clout on the show, and John Nathan Turner came in and said like, no, you're going to wear this burgundy scarf, you're going to wear these fucking question marks, and you're going to hang around with boy genius like Nyssa, who's kind of cool, but you don't really have any time to like work anything together, and you're going to kidnap him out the Australian. Like that's going to be your last season. And so he left.
Yeah, but you know, it happens.
It happens.
If you stay around 7 years, something's going to force you off.
Yes,
we'll be, to be honest. But okay, we've been talking around Kinda more than we've maybe been talking about Kinda. What do you want to talk about with the story of Kinda? Now that we've gotten the companions and everything out of the way, that makes this notable to you.
I think like the first thing I want to talk about is some of like the direction in particular. I love the first episode of this story, and I love the dream stuff. I think is like so weird and strange and unusual for Doctor Who, and is like striking in a way that Doctor Who typically is not. And I think it sort of ties that first episode together really well. Of it doing this thing that like Doctor Who didn't do that much of, having these like truly parallel stories of the Doctor and Adric are sort of exploring the planet and stumble into this military base and are sort of dealing with that, and that's sort of like the Heart of Darkness side of the show. And Tegan falls asleep under some like crystal wind chimes, and her subconscious is invaded by a creature we later learn is called the Mara. And she's sort of like subject to these weird sort of like mental games of having to confront a doppelganger of herself, and sort of like playing games with this weird sort of like clown-like figure that is talking in sort of like nonsense language, but in like the language of dreams. And that stuff is every, because this is the 3rd time I've watched this story. It's like those sequences always strike me as being interesting and surreal in a way that Doctor Who has never really done, and like kind of has never done since that much.
Yeah, I definitely like all of those sequences you're talking about. I have some stuff near the end I also want to talk about that I really liked, including, coming soon, Jonathan's defense of the inflatable snake.
Okay.
Because I think it's one of the best parts of the episode. I think particularly the stuff with Tegan in the dream world, where she's talking to a weird like goth kid who, is that supposed to be the Mara?
Yes, basically.
Yeah. I think all of that's pretty interesting. They start doubling Tegan up. They do all this CSO color screen overlay that's like very evocative and weird. Again, I don't know if it cohered for me, because I think this episode, to me, pays lip service to ideas more than it directly critically engages with them, but it is all very visually striking. And I also think the production design on this one is very good.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Christopher Bailey, the writer, talks about on the making of that, like, that's not really how he hoped the forest would look. It looks a little too like clean. They were not able to use by this point in the show like the nice BBC studio that they were used to using in like the Tom Baker years, and they were using kind of a more low rent one where they couldn't do anything with the floors. So one of the things you'll notice is this is a very, very flat forest.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things like a lot of people on the production were disappointed in. But I think you can kind of easily look past that. It is pretty interesting how thick that atmosphere looks. Like, it looks clearly this, they didn't build a whole forest, but it looks like, there's a lot of distance to that set, and I like that a lot.
Yeah.
And there's some of the stuff with like the wind chimes that's interesting. The set, I do agree. I think episode 1 is probably the best overall episode in this one, and it is. There's a lot of very interesting stuff in it.
Yeah, and it's something of I tend to like in Doctor Who when they pull in this sort of like experimental theater quality to it, particularly to the acting, and I think so. Like a lot of the guest actors bring that element to it, and it makes a lot of the guest characters in this episode pop to me in a way that in a lot of Doctor Who episodes they don't. And it's something of like the weird sort of like goth clown kid in the dream world who's like sort of a form of the Mara. He sort of has this weird, like, sort of like, it's like the acting is just not naturalistic and it's not going for naturalism, which I think is what it should be done, because most of the time when a Doctor Who guest character goes for naturalistic acting, it comes across as very boring. And I think all the characters, with the exception of maybe like the scientist lady, who's not a very extreme character, have this very sort of like over the top way of acting. Like, and if you go to like the military base side of things, you have the captain with the great like British mustache.
I do love that guy.
Yeah,
he totally feels like he's out of like a colonial painting or something.
Yeah, it's like he's like a Monty Python character or something.
He totally
he's
is.
So like this over the top British imperialistic authority figure. I think this episode, this story is very funny a lot of the time, particularly with those sorts of characters. And if I don't remember what exactly the line is, but there's something about like they're talking about. He says something about like there are too many opinions on this ship. It's like, is that your opinion? Yes, it is. But the one difference is that I'm in charge, and it's like that sort of lack of self-awareness that guy has.
I do think the guest character acting is fantastic in this one. The other person to mention is the old woman who plays, or who is like the wise old woman of the Kinda. And she's the one who can talk, and she has like there's a great line at some point of like, "Why do you speak, simple man?" or something like that. There's some great lines like that really should be gifts that are passed around a lot more often in this day and age. But yes,
So that whole element of the story is great. I just think the guest actors really sort of pop. I really like the guy who sort of, because like one half of the episode is the guy, I think Sanders is who it is, that is the private or whoever that is sort of in charge of the base, who then slowly over the course of the story is just like becoming more and more unhinged. He sort of tricks the two Kinda prisoners into like kind of allowing him into their like telepathic network or whatever, so he can control them. And he slowly sort of, in a very Heart of Darkness manner, he sort of gets these delusions of grandeur and kind of regresses into this very childlike state while trying to control this base and using them and playing these games.
He gets the delusions of grandeur, but less a la Marlon Brando in Apocalypse Now than that weird arc in Twin Peaks Season 2 when Richard Baymer thinks he's a Civil War colonel.
Sure.
Because it totally made me think of that when he's building his little town on the spaceship, of that section, that weird-ass section in Twin Peaks Season 2 when Richard Baymer, I forget the character's name, is trying to like do a big Civil War reenactment in his office.
Yeah. But I think, but here it says something to me about like the fundamental like sort of childish mentality and need for control that is like a fundamental element of colonialism. That, like, as like, because like part of his journey, I think, is just like stripping off all this sort of facade around what is like fundamentally this childish, destructive need to be in control and to play and to feel important. That is, that is hidden behind all these sort of like stoic British masculine bullshit, which is like very much what the Mustache Man has at the beginning of the story, and then he too like reverts into this like very sort of like doting grandfather sort of figure after he's exposed to the telepathic box.
Yeah,
just like some of the story is hard to talk about because like so much of what happens is not like actually present; it happens in the abstract.
Yes, it's very abstracted. These are the sorts of things that I do think if I were to sit with the episode longer, have the time to watch it again, it would cohere a little better for me, because you've had years to think about this episode, and some of those different threads. Because they never draw a specific line between a lot of these different threads. And some of those I think are scripting weaknesses, and some of those I think are scripting strengths. But it is an interesting and notable part of the episode that, like, really, like, the central threat that's resolved at the end with defeating the Mara has nothing directly to do with the captain going crazy on the ship. And I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is something that throws you off a little bit.
Sure.
In that it's more of a thematic tonal connection than it is a literal plot one. Like, defeating the Mara frees the dude from his insanity, but it's also not like a pressing thing of like he's going to hit a button and destroy the world. Or is he at the end? Does he have a bomb?
Yes, yeah.
He does?
That's the end of the story, is that like he has gone so far down his like own weird insanity of thinking that the trees are like monsters that are trying to attack him, that his solution to that is to blow up the entire complex and the world.
Ignore some of what I said then. I thought I was getting this mixed up with the episode The Face of Evil, which I also just watched,
right,
which is also about a like colonial force on a planet, sort of on a planet with savages.
Yes,
except
on a forest planet.
On
with
a forest
savages.
planet,
but that one's a very dark forest. This is very bright forest.
But there's enough like little similarities, and it also ends with someone wants to hit a button and blow everything up. I thought that's the one I was thinking of. So sorry.
Yeah, this one has the great scene where they're wiring up the bombs, and then the mustache guy who is like gone full into like doting grandfather mode,
which is very funny.
Yeah, is like going through this whole process. Is like and the nexus of all of the explosions where it'll be the most powerful is right here, right where the one guy is sitting. It's like perfect.
Yes.
Like that's what I want. Because it is like, it is this element of him being driven to insanity, and what the Mara is in that side of the story, and what you sort of find out like through talking to the wise woman of the Kinda, is that the Mara is an agent of chaos, fundamentally. It's that it comes from, I like this, like it comes from the dark places of the inside, which is a good little, like weird concept of like a way to sort of explain what the Mara is without really explaining what the Mara is. But that it sort of like wants to feed on chaos and destruction, and sort of is part of this sort of cycle of destruction and rebirth that the Kinda are aware of on this planet, that the rest of the characters are not really, because they have been injected into this and are not sort of like exposed to the spiritual telepathic nature of what all the Kinda have. It is something that it is a hard story to sort of like fully grasp all the different threads, but it is something that I think for me, because this is the experience I had the first time I watched it. There is something I feel like is cumulative about it, that for me, like both of those sides of the story, the Mara and the military base, build up together to be this sort of like interesting conclusion that is about these things of like being comfortable with what you have control over and yourself in your community, and not like sort of like trying to be this character who's like the military commander who is afraid of everything because he doesn't have control over it. He's afraid of the forest because he doesn't understand the forest, and he can't like control and grasp and manipulate the forest. And that is what sort of reverts him to this childlike state, and the state that the Kinda are in is so much at like sort of peace with themselves. I think it's an interesting dynamic. That again, it's something of like that resolution, that conclusion is something that Doctor Who never goes to. Because most of a lot of the time, Doctor Who honestly has this tendency to sort of like very subtly reinforce sort of like British imperialistic themes, because it is going to, like, it's inevitable at some point. It's inevitable at some point to read the Doctor in a lot of stories as being an element of British imperialism as opposed to being opposed to it, which is what they want to draft the figure as, but he's not always, I think, actually properly narratively put in that position. And here the Doctor is like, no, like, this isn't my story. Like, I'm hands off. Like, I get to sort of wander around and witness what's going on, but this is not like me. This is like, I don't control this planet any more than they do. Like, the Doctor himself thinks that the Kinda are savage for like most of the first episode, and then realizes that he has the same attitude that the colonizers have. It's something that like the show is just usually not aware of those kinds of ideas.
Yeah, I do think there's an argument to be made, and actually, I think it's Eric Sayward makes the argument in the bonus features that there's a more character-centric, like Doctor-centric specifically, version of this story you could tell, where like that awakening he has of like, maybe I was prejudiced in thinking that too, and learning to like, not tie into these imperialist themes. Like, that's a story that, might resonate with some people more because it would have more of a clear center. And like Eric Sayward talks about in the bonus features, that he felt like the way Christopher Bailey wrote this one, the Doctor was off to the side and incidental, and it didn't feel to him like a proper Doctor Who story because of that. I don't know if I fully agree with that specific criticism. I do see how you could rework it to fit that more. It also wouldn't quite be the Kinda we got, for better or for worse. Like,
I think one of the reasons why I like it is that it doesn't conform to that. And I tend to like when Doctor Who tries to push the boundaries of what Doctor Who can do, and one of the ways you can do that is make it so that the Doctor is not the key central figure of the story. Because like one of the main character traits of the Doctor is that he's a control freak. That like every time he walks into a room, he has to be the person in control of the room. Like, and he hates it whenever he's not. Like, that is like through most of the incarnations, I think the Fifth Doctor is a bit more lax on that. but generally speaking, and especially when we get to Colin Baker, like, that is who the Doctor is that if he walks into the room and everyone doesn't think that he's the smartest person in the room, he gets upset about that fact. And I kind of like it when, no, like, this isn't about you, really. Like, this is, like, you can kind of help out a little bit, but ultimately this situation probably would have resolved itself without the Doctor. Like the Kinda would have probably managed it. The Wise Woman would have probably managed it. Like, they have that whole great sequence. One of my favorite parts of the story, when the Wise Woman, who I now see is called Panna, it finds the Doctor with the scientist woman and is just like, no, I want the scientist woman. Like, I don't care about you.
Yeah.
And she says this great line, what's he babbling about? No male can open the box of jhana without being driven out of his mind. It is well known. Unless, is he an idiot? Are you an idiot? Well, I suppose I must be. I've been called 1 minute. Keep silent, idiot.
Yeah.
and that's, I like that part of the story that it's like, that's like the Doctor is an idiot. Like, this is not your story, dude. Get out of here. Like, we want to talk to this lady. Like, she's the one who can actually resolve this situation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it okay if we jump ahead to the snake scene?
Sure.
Okay. I want to offer my defense of the snake scene.
Okay.
And the puppet blow-up inflatable, like, pool toy snake.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. I think that sequence is very interestingly directed, where you've got all the mirrors in a circle, and this thing is kind of rising up through it, and you have to kind of, it's this kind of moment of faith of, like, hold the line until we can get it. There's the threat that, like, Tegan might be drawn back in.
Yeah. All
of that. I find it pretty exciting. I also think because it is the fakest looking fucking snake in the world, its eyes, like, look like Kermit the Frog, like pinball things, where they're sticking in different directions. It's very odd. It looks completely not alive and otherworldly.
It's like its jaw is just lax open all the time because clearly there's nothing to make it open and close.
Right. To me, that actually kind of works. It looks inhuman. It doesn't look like it's just a fucking snake. It looks... It goes so far over the line of being fake, it comes back around to being uncanny. And there's something about that I actually think... for me, it helps underline the best parts of the episode, which are the intangible, unknowable visual things going on, where the Kinda probably understand this stuff, but the Doctor ultimately doesn't. A lot of the main characters ultimately don't. The military people in that Heart of Darkness way can't ultimately understand it, and having the snake be that bizarre looking, for me, there was something aesthetically that worked about that. And it was reinforced when the DVD has a special edition of Episode 4, where they've gone in and done a CGI version of the snake and made the snake look very realistic. I don't think that works. I don't think that's what it should be. It's not supposed to be a literal, like, big snake. It's, that's not what the Mara is. It's this idea. It's this, weird, dark force, at least as I understood it in this story. And it being that weird and inhuman kind of worked for me. Now, could you have gotten that across somewhere in the middle between puppet inflatable, wacky waving inflatable arm flailing snake man and, photorealistic CGI snake? Yes, there's probably a comfortable middle ground in there, but I liked how it worked, and I would actually definitely prefer that to the CGI redo of that.
Yeah, I mean, I basically agree. It's just something of, in 2017 or 2018 now, it's hard to get upset about bad special effects from 1982 because most of the effects look fucking terrible. Before I watched Kinda, I watched the beginning of Castrovalva, which is the Fifth Doctor's first story, just to sort of like get in the Fifth Doctor mood. And I really like Castrovalva. And that story begins with this fucking just awful effect of... I forget, it's like the Master's TARDIS is like zapping somebody. I forget exactly what it was. It's like he's zapping somebody and you can see him in the monitor. And it's just like I could literally make that effect with like the software I have on my computer in like 5 minutes. It's the worst sort of like cartoon explosion with like flashing like red and yellow colors interchanging. It's really terrible. So going to the like inflatable silly looking snake, I don't really have much of an issue with it. And it's something of... It does almost sort of contribute to the like weird experimental theater show quality of the story that like kind of like I almost wish that there were just like people like in the middle of that circle dressed like head to toe all in black with like big sticks like waving the snake up and down just like that's what it is.
That's actually a very good point. It's like a kabuki or Broadway or some kind of like effect that feels a little more Broadway wouldn't be this, but a little more folksy.
Yeah.
That kind of fits the story. And I liked that about it. I found that scene freaky and charming.
Yes, I agree. And it's something that I see, especially if you're watching the story in 1982 while it was being aired. I think it would be way harder to see it in that light, because there you're you have all the issues of people making fun of the show for its bad special effects and stuff like that. But now, from our comfortable position in 2018, it's it looks fine. It looks fine compared to everything else. All this footage looks fucking terrible.
No, it's fun. This is actually one of the better looking stories on DVD. They've remastered it enough that it's a newer one too. Yeah. Relatively, we're into the 80s now. By the way, I looked it up and I found the line I found really funny in this episode from the Doctor, and I wanted to say it really quick because I forgot it earlier. So this is the Doctor and whoever he's with, I forget, are eating an apple and they're not supposed to, and he says, "You're not allowed to eat the apple." Great line. I can totally imagine Tom Baker doing that. It is Peter Davison totally makes it his own, though.
Yes,
and it's very funny, in a very deadpan way.
Yeah, because the way that he plays it makes it feel like the Doctor very sort of naturally realized what he was saying in the middle of him saying it, instead of trying to make a joke about it.
Yes.
It's just oh yeah, never mind.
Yeah.
Then goes off. Yeah.
Any other final thoughts on Kinda before we start to wrap this up?
I do want to note with that, I do think the story is very funny, and I appreciate that. I think and it's funny in the right places and serious in the right places. I like it's a weird experimental element. The last thing I sort of want to talk about a little bit is with Peter Grimwade. And to sort of kind of close the story out, and in some ways preview a little bit also for when we talk about the Sixth Doctor era and continue deeper into John Nathan Turner and the adventures of Doctor Who versus the BBC. I want to read this interview that...
Oh, right, yeah.
That was a fairly infamous interview from around the time where Doctor Who was initially canceled. We'll talk about that, and then was brought back. And it's by Eric Sayward, the script editor, and talking about his relationship with John Nathan Turner, and specifically revolving around the issues of getting directors back, and with Peter Grimwade. So, for this interview... Sayward says, "Well, the constant thing of having to do everything for tuppence interference does go on. John can become so unpleasant to someone he's employed, such as his director. The likes of Graham Harper will not come back to Doctor Who if they've got something else to do," which is a funny quote, because Graham Harper did come back to Doctor Who, because he came back in the revived show and did a lot of Doomsday and a lot of the big RTD episodes.
He did a ton of episodes for RTD. Very talented
in the
director.
classic era, he directed several episodes, including Caves of Androzani.
Yeah.
But people like Peter Grimwade, who I suppose is the only other director of any note who has come out of Who since John has been producer, says he wouldn't work with John Nathan Turner anymore, and I don't think Nathan Turner would employ him. And the question, the interviewer says, "There was some row, wasn't there?" Sayward, "It was a lunatic situation. Grimwade directed a script I had written called Earthshock. He made the story work well, so John decided he could direct Resurrection of the Daleks. Peter had been booked, and then there was a strike. So the story was canceled. Grimwade said, 'Fine, well obviously we can't do anything about it. If I've got nothing better to do, I'm going to have lunch and go home.' So he took me," remember I was an author as well as a script editor on the show, "and his production manager and one or two other members of the team. I think there were about 6 of us. We went to the television center for lunch. I mean, so exciting. It's unbelievable. Only to find when we got back that John Nathan Turner had been shouting and screaming all over the building, 'How dare they all go off to lunch together and not invite me?' 'Oh no,' says the interviewer, Sayward. 'It's true. Yes, he was furious and it was so silly. How dare they? I'm the one who does the hiring and firing around here. How dare he take... He took exception to me going because he said, how dare he take my script editor to lunch and not me? He took that absolutely as an out-and-out insult, and that was a contributing factor to why Peter was never invited back.' And the interviewer says, 'No!' Sayward says, 'Pathetic, isn't it? It's mind-numbing. One of the 2 half-decent directors is out on the show he will not use because of a silly, stupid incident like that.'"
Yeah, I don't know if John Nathan Turner was the best person to be running Doctor Who.
I don't think he was.
I actually wanted to ask you that question. Yeah. Obviously there are many things you and other people like about this era of the show, and we don't want to erase that, but at the same time, do you think the things that worked because of John Nathan Turner in spite, or some mixture of that?
I think it's mostly in spite. I think, and I don't want... I do want to recognize that he had a very difficult situation with the BBC, and that is part of what contributed to it. But he also, I think, heavily exacerbated that relationship. And if you had a better producer in that role, that maybe that wouldn't have happened. It would have gotten better. And I do think, it is important to note that once you get to the Seventh Doctor era, I think it gets very good. The Seventh Doctor's last 2 seasons are very good, and he is still technically producer of those. But overall, when you look back at it, I think it's important to note that almost every single major producer that was in the same sort of role that John Nathan Turner was in before John Nathan Turner on Doctor Who was a writer originally, and that was part of their job. They started as a writer. Oftentimes they were also a script editor, and then they became a producer, and that's how they got into the show in that role. And so people like Peter Hinchcliffe or Barry Letts, they had an intimate understanding from a creative position of what made the show tick. And John Nathan Turner, in every single interview with him, about him, for people who knew him working on the show, it feels like he is like when you say the word producer and you think of the biggest negative cliche in your mind, that is kind of who John Nathan Turner seemed to be based on all evidence.
Well, we'll get to continue that story next month.
Yes.
Do you want to continue to our preview of our next episode?
Yes. Our next episode, we'll be going deeper into the 80s, deeper into John Nathan Turner, right to the edge of Doctor Who being canceled for the first time, and we're going to be watching what I think is the very best Sixth Doctor story, The Vengeance on Varos, which I'm very excited to do this.
I already have this one. I don't have to get anything. Awesome.
Yes.
Vengeance on Varos.
Yes, as we'll be able to talk about Colin Baker. We'll be able to talk about his magnificent multicolored rainbow dream coat, and all sorts of wonderful things next time on Doctor Who.